I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
The doorbell rang at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning, which is exactly the time when the universe should know better than to interrupt a man who is currently 4 stories up, communing with 1,000 orchids. I was in the office, giving the typewriter a workout on some routine reports, while Fritz was in the kitchen engaged in a life-or-death struggle with a rack of lamb. I didn't get up immediately. I waited to see if the person on the other side of the door had the stamina to ring twice. They did. I crossed the hallway and peered through the one-way glass. Standing on the stoop was a woman who looked like she had been carved out of a very expensive piece of ice. She wore a navy-tailored suit that managed to be both modest and intimidating, and she held a small leather portfolio against her chest as if it were a shield. She wasn't shifting her weight or checking her watch. She was just waiting for the mountain to move. I opened the door, but I didn't retreat. If you're selling subscriptions to the Modern Actuary, we've already got 2. If you're looking for Mr. Wolfe, he's currently 300 feet above sea level and won't be back on Earth until 11. My name is Genevieve Vane, she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor in her hands that didn't match the rest of her performance. I am not selling anything, Mr. Goodwin. I am here to tell Mr. Wolfe that there is something in this house that does not belong here. Something that was put here last night while you were sleeping. I felt the skin on the back of my neck do a little dance. I've lived in this brownstone for years, and I flatter myself that I know every creak in the floorboards and every draft under the doors. That's a tall order, Miss Vane. Fritz and I don't exactly sleep with earplugs. If someone had come in, they'd have a few extra holes in them by now. They didn't come through the front door, she said, her eyes darting toward the street, and they didn't steal. They came to hide. May I come in, or would you prefer I explain the details of your basement's new contents to the patrolman on the corner? I let her in, mostly because I didn't like the way she said basement. I escorted her into the office and gave her the red leather chair, the one that has seen more liars and lunatics than a night court in Brooklyn. I didn't offer her a drink. I sat at my desk and watched her until the clock on the mantel struck 11. The elevator groaned, a sound that usually signals the arrival of a massive intellect and a massive appetite. Nero Wolfe stepped out, his yellow-gold eyes sweeping the room before he even reached his desk. He saw Miss Vane, and his lips tightened by a fraction of a millimeter. To anyone else, it was a blank face. To me, it was a roar of annoyance. Archie, Wolfe said, navigating his bulk into the custom-built chair that was the only thing in the world truly capable of supporting him. There is a woman in the office. Her name is Genevieve Vane, I said. She says we have a house guest we haven't met yet, downstairs specifically. Wolfe leaned back, his fingers interlaced over his center of gravity. He looked at Miss Vane with the weary patience of a man who has heard every possible variation of human nonsense. Well, I am not a landlord, and I am certainly not a curator of mysteries. What is in my basement? My brother, she said. Wolfe's eyebrows went up a hair. Your brother? Is he a plumber? A fugitive? Or perhaps a ghost? He is dead, Mr. Wolfe, she whispered, and for the first time the ice began to crack. And he is behind the false wall in your furnace room. I know this because I was the one who was supposed to meet him there last night. He had the ledger that proves the Sterling-Vaughan merger is a fraud, and he told me that if anything happened to him, your house was the only place in New York where the truth would be safe. He didn't tell me he'd be the one hidden behind the bricks. Wolfe didn't move. He didn't even blink. He just stared at her, the silence in the room growing so thick it felt like it was pressing against the windows. The sanctity of the brownstone hadn't just been disturbed, it had been turned into a tomb. Archie, Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a register that meant business. Get the flashlight, and tell Fritz to postpone lunch. It appears we have an uninvited preference for the macabre. I went to the kitchen and gave Fritz the news. He didn't drop the whisk. Fritz is a professional, but his face went the color of a blanched almond. I told him to stay in the kitchen, keep the chain on the back door, and for heaven's sake, keep the exhaust fan running so the smell of roasting lamb didn't get tangled up with whatever we were about to find in the cellar. Then I went to the hallway closet, grabbed the heavy-duty electric torch and a pry bar, and headed for the basement stairs. The basement of the brownstone is a sprawling, shadowed kingdom of stone and pipe. It's where the furnace lives, a great cast-iron beast that Wolfe treats with more respect than most of his clients. I led the way, with Genevieve Vane following close enough to step on my heels. She wasn't shaking anymore, she was brittle, like a piece of glass that had already been shattered and just hadn't realized it yet. We reached the furnace room. It was warm, humming with the steady pulse of the boiler. To the left of the coal chute, same one that had been a nuisance in a previous life, was a stretch of brickwork that looked as solid as the foundation of the Brooklyn Bridge. But as I ran the beam of the torch over the mortar, I saw it, a thin, jagged line of grey dust on the floor. Fresh mortar doesn't shed like that unless someone has been playing mason in the middle of the night. Here? I asked, pointing to the light. She nodded, her throat working as she tried to swallow. He said the third pillar. Behind the auxiliary shut-off valve, there's a hollow space designed for the original plumbing. He called it his insurance policy. I didn't waste time. I wedged the pry bar into a loose seam and gave it a heave. The bricks didn't put up much of a fight. They had been stacked with more haste than skill. After the fourth brick came away, the smell hit me. It wasn't the smell of a man who had been dead for a week, but the sharp, metallic scent of fresh blood and the cloying sweetness of expensive gardenia perfume. I cleared enough of the opening to see a shoulder clad in tweed and a hand that was unnervingly pale against the soot-stained floor. It was a man, okay. He was tucked into the crawl space like a discarded winter coat. I didn't need to check for a pulse to know that the insurance policy had matured. "Is that your brother?" I asked, keeping my voice flat. She looked, gave a small, choked gasp, and turned away. "Julian. That's Julian." I reached in not to move him. Cramer would have my head if I disturbed the tableau, but to see if the ledger she mentioned was tucked into his jacket. My fingers hit something hard and rectangular, but before I could pull it out, I heard a floorboard groan directly above us, not in the kitchen, in the south room. The south room is on the third floor, but the acoustics of these old brownstones are a funny thing. The service pipes act like a giant stethoscope, and what I heard wasn't the steady tread of Fritz or the heavy rumble of Wolfe. It was the light, frantic scuffle of someone who knew exactly where they were going and was in a very big hurry to get there. "Stay here," I told Genevieve. "Don't touch anything. If anyone comes down those stairs who isn't me or a man weighing 300 pounds, scream like you mean it." I took the stairs 3 at a time, my rubber soles silent on the carpet. I bypassed the office and the dining room, heading straight for the elevator. I didn't use ITU much noise. I took the service stairs, my heart thumping a rhythm that matched the urgency of the situation. When I reached the third-floor landing, the door to the south room was standing wide open. This room is the Brownstones' version of a guest suite. It's yellow, it's sunny, and it's usually the most peaceful spot in the house. Now, it looked like a hurricane had been through it. The mattress had been stripped, the drawers of the mahogany vanity were pulled out, and the floral wallpaper near the baseboard had been sliced open with a precision that suggested a very sharp knife and a very desperate mind. Standing in the center of the room was a man I had never seen. He was tall, silver-haired, and looked like he belonged on the cover of a bank's annual report. He was holding a small, velvet-lined box, and his face was a mask of cold, focused fury. "I assume you have a reservation?" I said, leaning against the door frame with the pry bar still in my hand. He didn't jump. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Goodwin, I presume? You are remarkably fast for a man of your build. I am Vance Arthur Vance, and I believe you have something in your basement that belongs to me. The body or the ledger?" I asked, "because the body is definitely staying, and the ledger is currently a ward of the state. Or it will be as soon as I can get a dial tone." Vance smiled, a thin, bloodless expression. "The body is a tragedy. The ledger is a technicality. But the contents of this box is why your house was chosen, Mr. Goodwin. This is the violation that Nero Wolfe will never forgive." He moved then, not toward me, but toward the window. Before I could reach him, he had tossed the box into the alleyway below. The sanctity of the brownstone hadn't just been disturbed, it had been used as a trash can for a conspiracy that was rapidly becoming lethal. I went to the window, but the alley was empty. Whoever had caught that box was already halfway to the West Side Highway. I looked back at Vance. He was straightening his tie, looking as unruffled as a man who had just finished a pleasant lunch. "You can call Inspector Cramer now," he said. "The evidence is gone, and the guest who refused to leave is finally checking out." I returned to the office with Arthur Vance in tow, keeping a firm grip on his elbow. He didn't struggle, he walked with the detached elegance of a man who had already won the first round and was simply waiting for the referee to count to 10. Wolfe was still behind his desk, but he wasn't alone. Genevieve Vane had come up from the basement, her face a mask of grief and fury, and she was standing by the window, staring at the man I had just marched into the room. "Arthur," she said, her voice like a whip, "you killed him." "A premature conclusion, Genevieve," Vance replied, smoothing his silver hair. "I arrived at this house to prevent a catastrophe, not to cause one. Julian was always impulsive. He thought Mr. Wolfe's reputation for privacy would act as a shield for his own criminal incompetence. It appears he was mistaken. Wolfe didn't look at Vance. He didn't even look at Genevieve. His yellow gold eyes were fixed on the bookshelf directly behind my desk, specifically the section housing the legal tomes. "Archie," Wolfe said, and his voice had that low, dangerous rumble that usually precedes a seismic event. "The third volume of Blackstone's commentaries. Move it." I frowned, letting go of Vance's arm. I stepped over to the shelf. The Blackstone volumes are heavy, bound in scuffed calfskin, and they haven't been moved since the last time Wolfe wanted to cite a 17th century precedent for why he shouldn't pay a plumbing bill. I reached for the third volume. It felt lighter than it should. When I removed it, I saw why. The middle of the book had been neatly hollowed outer cavity carved through centuries of English common law to make room for a modern intrusion. Inside the hollow was a small brass-bound ledger and a single dried sprig of rosemary. "The violation," Wolfe murmured, his lips thinning to a white line. "It was not enough to hide a corpse in my basement. You felt it necessary to mutilate my library. You have treated this Rumthes sanctuary as if it were a common dead drop for a street corner informant." "I didn't put that there," Vance said, his voice losing a bit of its polished sheen. "I was upstairs. I was looking for the box. The box you threw into the alley," I reminded him, "the one with the velvet lining." Wolfe ignored us both. He reached out and took the hollowed-out Blackstone from my hands. He didn't look at the ledger inside, he looked at the jagged edges of the cut pages. To destroy a book is an act of barbarism. To do so in my presence is a declaration of war. "Mr. Vance, you represent the Sterling Vaughan Trust. Your brother, Julian Vane, was a senior auditor. Miss Vane, you are the beneficiary of a family estate that is currently being liquidated to facilitate a merger with the Holloway Group. These are the facts of the public record." He leaned forward, his bulk casting a shadow across the desk. "But the facts of this house are different. Last night someone entered through the service door, a door that was locked from the inside. They brought a body, they brought a knife, and they brought a sense of entitlement that I find intolerable. They did not just hide a secret, they sought to involve me in its preservation." "Julian knew you were the only one Thorne couldn't buy," Genevieve said, her voice trembling. "He said if he put the ledger in your hands, the merger would die. He didn't realize Thorne had a man inside the house." "A man inside the house?" I asked, my hand moving toward my holster. "Fritz has been here 20 years. I've been here 10, unless the furnace has started taking bribes. There isn't an inside man." "And yet," Wolfe said, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the sprig of rosemary resting in the hollowed book. "The rosemary did not come from the market. It came from Fritz's herb garden in the backyard. It was cut with a pair of kitchen shirst ones with the chipped blade. Archie, go to the kitchen. Do not speak to Fritz. Look at the rack where the shears are kept. If they are missing, we have a guest who is far more intimate with our routines than Mr. Vance would like us to believe." I headed for the kitchen, my mind racing. The idea of a breach was one thing, but the idea that someone had been walking through the Brownstone, using our tools and raiding our garden while we slept, made the air feel cold. I found the shears exactly where they belonged, but as I picked them up, I saw a smear of something dark on the handle, not blood, ink. The same deep, saturated blue ink that had marked the ledger in the previous case. I walked back into the office and held up the shears. "They are here, but they've been busy, and Vance isn't the only one who likes expensive pens," Wolfe grunted. "So, we have a circle of suspects that includes a dead auditor, an icy sister, a silver-haired trustee, and a phantom who knows the way to the herb garden. Archie, call Saul Panzer. Tell him I want a list of every employee at the Sterling Vaughan Trust who has ever visited this house for a consultation. And tell him to bring his raincoat. The shadow in the alleyway hasn't gone far. Vance started to speak, but Wolfe held up a hand. Silence. I am thinking. And when I think, the world and the Sterling Vaughan Trust must wait. I reached for the telephone and dialed the number that every operative in the city wishes they had on speed dial. Saul Panzer answered on the second ring, his voice as steady as a dial tone. I gave him the shorthand corpse in the coal chute, the mutilated Blackstone, and the silver-haired trustee currently cooling his heels in our red leather chair. Saul didn't ask for a map, he asked for the frequency. I told him to start with the alleyway behind the tailor shop and work his way toward the Holloway Group's executive garage. If a velvet box had been tossed from our third-story window, it wouldn't have sprouted wings and flown to New Jersey. And Saul, I added, glancing at Wolfe, who was staring at the smear of blue ink on the kitchen shears with the intensity of a diamond cutter. Keep an eye out for a shadow that knows its way around a herb garden. We've got a trespasser who doesn't just break locks, they borrow the silverware. "Him on it, Archie," Saul said, and the line went dead. Wolfe looked up. "Mr. Vance, you will remain in the south room. Miss Vane, you will occupy the front room. Neither of you will communicate with the outside world, and specifically, neither of you will touch the telephone. Archie, since our guests are so fond of our architecture, you will perform a perimeter check, not the dorsed sidewalk. I want to know who is interested enough in this brownstone to stand in the rain without an umbrella." I grabbed my raincoat and my hat, feeling the familiar weight of the Marley, 38 against my ribs. The rain had turned from a drizzle into a cold, persistent grey curtain that made the stone buildings of West 35th Street look like they were weeping. I stepped out onto the stoop, lit a cigarette, and played the part of a man wondering if he should have stayed in bed. The street was mostly empty, save for a delivery truck unloading crates of poultry 2 doors down and a woman in a beige trench coat struggling with a broken umbrella near the hydrant. I walked toward the corner, my eyes scanning the parked cars. There was a grey sedan with steamed-up windows sitting 50 yards from our Dora Classic stakeout position. I didn't head for the car. Instead, I ducked into the recessed doorway of a closed laundromat and waited. 5 minutes passed. The woman with the broken umbrella gave up on it, tossed it into a trash can, and started walking not away, but toward the brownstone. She didn't look like a hitman, and she didn't look like a corporate spy. She looked like a secretary who had just lost a very long argument with a filing cabinet. She stopped in front of our stoop, looked at the windows, and then did something that made my pulse jump. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small, blue-inked fountain pen, and scribbled something on a scrap of paper before tucking it under the windshield wiper of the grey sedan. I moved. I didn't run. That attracts the wrong kind of attention, but I cut across the street with the kind of purposeful stride that says I have a badge and I am not afraid to use it. I reached the sedan just as the woman turned the corner. I didn't follow her. I grabbed the note. It was a single line of elegant, looping script. "The mountain is awake. The cellar is compromised. Move to the secondary vault." I looked at the driver's side of the sedan. The window rolled down 3 inches, revealing a pair of dark glasses and a jawline that looked like it had been carved out of granite. "Problem, officer?" the voice asked. It was a voice I recognized, same driver from the Buick yesterday, the one Wolfe had dismissed as a mental pygmy. "No problem," I said, leaning an elbow on the roof. "Just delivering mail. Your friend dropped this. And by the way, Mr. Wolfe would like to know if you prefer your beer in a glass or straight from the bottle. He finds it rude when people wait outside in the rain without an invitation." The car didn't wait for a reply. The engine roared to life, and the grey sedan peeled away from the curb, leaving a cloud of exhaust and a very frustrated Archie Goodwin in its wake. I looked at the moat again. The ink was still damper deep, royal blue that matched the smear on Fritz's shears. I headed back inside, my coat dripping on the rug. I went straight to the office. Wolfe was still in his chair, but the Blackstone volume was open on his desk, and he was using a magnifying glass to examine the edges of the hollowed-out cavity. "The shadow has a name," I said, dropping the note onto the desk, or at least a handwriting style. She's a woman in a beige coat, and she's reporting to our friend from the Buick. They know we found the body, and Thea moving to a secondary vault. Wolfe took note, his eyes tracking the script. A secondary vault, a term used by bankers and burglars. But look at the M in Mountain, Archie. Notice the exaggerated serif. This is the hand of someone trained in the European-style Swiss or German. And look at the paper. He held it to the light. I saw the watermark, a stylized S entwined with a V Sterling Vaughan Trust, I said. So the shadow is an employee, not just an employee, Wolfe murmured, his eyes narrowing. A confident. Someone who has access to the internal records, the family secrets, and apparently the blueprints of this house. We are not dealing with a simple murder, Archie. We are dealing with an insurrection. Someone is trying to take over the Sterling Vaughan Trust by using my basement as a graveyard and my library as a ledger, and they have made a fatal error. What's that? I asked. They assumed I would be more interested in the body than the book, Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous purr. They forgot that while a corpse is a tragedy, a ruined Blackstone is a personal insult. I went back to the kitchen to see if Fritz had managed to salvage his sanity along with the lamb. The house felt tight, as if the walls were leaning in to catch a whisper of what was happening in the office. Fritz was standing by the silver cabinet, his face set in a grim mask of culinary tragedy. He didn't look at me. He looked at the velvet-lined drawer where the condiment service was kept. "Archie," he said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. The English mustard pot. The silver one with the lion's paw feet. "Don't tell me it's gone for a walk too," I said, leaning against the door frame. "It is not gone. It has been emptied, scrubbed with a brush that does not belong in this kitchen, and refilled with a substance that is most certainly not mustard. I smelled it, Archie. It smells of the laboratory, not the larder." I walked over and took a look. The little silver pot was gleaming, but inside was a thick, translucent paste that looked like something Yaud used to patch a tire. I didn't touch it. Wolfe needs to see this. "And Fritz, did you see anyone near this cabinet this morning, between the time the bell rang and the time I came back from the basement?" "No one," Fritz insisted, his hands trembling slightly. I was preparing the endivs. I did not leave the kitchen for more than a minute to check the mail. But the service door, the bolt was thrown, Archie. I am certain of it. Yet when I looked again, it was as if it had never been touched. I took the mustard pot into the office on a small tray. Wolfe was still staring at the note ID brought him, but he looked up as I set the silver piece on his desk. I explained Fritz's discovery. Wolfe didn't recoil. He leaned in, his nostrils flared, sniffing the air around the pot with the clinical focus of a bloodhound. "Epoxy," Wolfe said, his voice flat. "A high-grade industrial adhesive. Why would a trespasser bother to clean a mustard pot and fill it with glue, Archie? Maybe Thea planning on sticking the Sterling Vaughan Trust back together," I suggested. "No, they are sealing something, or they are preparing to. Look at the lid." He pointed a thick finger at the underside of the silver cover. There was a tiny, microscopic scratch, as if someone had used a diamond-tipped tool to etch a series of coordinates. They aren't just hiding a body, Archie. They are using the fixed points of this house to mark a map. Basement, library, and now kitchen. They are triangulating. The phone rang, breaking the tension. It was Saul. He sounded like he was running, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "Archie, I found the box, or what's left of it. It was in the hands of a messenger boy on 42nd Street. He was told to deliver it to a Mr. Richards at the entrance of the Sterling Vaughan building. But the box was empty. No jewels, no microfilm, nothing." "Then why the chase?" I asked. "Because the velvet lining had been soaked in a chemical that reacts to ultraviolet light," Saul said. I followed the trail. "It doesn't lead to trust, Archie. It leads back to 35th Street, to the house next door." I looked at Wolfe. He had heard every word. The house next door was a brownstone almost identical to ours, currently owned by a retired judge who spent most of his time in Florida. It should be empty, except for a weekly cleaning service. "The secondary vault," Wolfe murmured. "Archie, the blueprints. Now." I scrambled to the cabinet and pulled out the architectural drawings of the block. Wolfe spread them across his desk, his eyes darting between our basement layout and the judge's property. "There," he said, tapping a spot on the common wall. In 1902, there was a shared coal tunnel. It was blocked during the Prohibition era to prevent federal agents from moving between houses. If someone has reopened that tunnel, they don't need the front door. They have a subterranean highway. The increased pressure was starting to make the floorboards hum. We had a corpse in our cellar, a mutilated book in our library, and a silver mustard pot full of industrial glue that was likely intended to seal the very tunnel Wolfe had just identified. The shadow wasn't just an employee, they were a squatter who had been using the judge's empty house as a base of operations to dismantle the Sterling Vaughan Trust from beneath our feet. "Call the judge's service," Wolfe ordered. "Find out who has the keys, and Archie, your coat again. We are going to perform a social call on our neighbor. If the secondary vault is where I think it is, we are not just looking for a ledger. We are looking for the person who held the knife while Julian Vane was being fitted for a brick overcoat." "What about Vance and Genevieve?" I asked, nodding toward the rooms where our guests were stashed. "Leave them," Wolfe said. "They are distractions. The real player is next door, waiting for the glue to dry." I headed for the door, the silver mustard pot still sitting on the desk like a tiny, expensive bomb. The mystery wasn't just knocking at the door anymore, it was breathing through the walls. I stepped back out into the drizzle, but I didn't use the front stoop. I went through the service door and slipped into the narrow, damp alleyway that separates our brownstone from the judge's residence. The brickwork was slick with city grime, and the air tasted of wet soot. I met Saul Panzer by the basement window of the house next door. He looked like a stray cat that had just found a particularly interesting trash canquet alert and entirely at home in the shadows. "The lock on this window has been shimmed," Saul whispered, pointing to a faint scratch on the brass catch. "Professional job. Not a scratch on the frame, but the mechanism is dead. I've already been inside. Dust on the floor has been swept into the corners, Archie. Someone's been living here for at least 3 days. There's a cot in the laundry room and enough canned soup to last a week." "Any sign of our friend in the beige coat?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "She left 10 minutes ago through the front, but the basement is where the action is." I found the other side of that coal tunnel Wolfe was talking about. It's been braced with new timber, and there's a smell of fresh epoxy that'll peel the paint off your teeth. I followed Saul through the window. The judge's basement was a mirror image of ours, but colder and smelling of abandonment. We moved toward the common wall. Sure enough, a section of the old foundation had been surgically removed. A narrow, reinforced crawl space led directly toward our furnace room. Sitting on a wooden crate next to the opening was a specialized ultraviolet lamp and a stack of blue-bound folders. "The secondary vault," I muttered. "They weren't just hiding Julian Vane's body, they were using our house as a physical firewall. If the police raided the Sterling Vaughan offices or the Thorne residence, they'd find nothing. The real evidence was sitting 10 feet away from Nero Wolfe's beer cooler." I took one of the folders. It was filled with transfer records, millions of dollars moving from the trust into offshore accounts held by a shell company called Gardenia Holdings. The Gardenia perfume ID smelled on the corpse wasn't a fashion choice, it was a signature. Suddenly, a heavy thud vibrated through the floorboards above us. It wasn't a footstep, it was the sound of something a summoner falling. Then came the unmistakable click-clack of a woman's heels, moving rapidly toward the stairs. "Saul, stay in the tunnel," I snapped. "If anyone tries to retreat into our basement, pin them. I'm going up." I took the stairs to the judge's ground floor. The house was furnished in heavy, dark mahogany that made every shadow look like a person. I reached the hallway just in time to see the front door standing open. A figure was silhouetted against the streetlights, the woman in the beige coat. She wasn't running, she was dragging a heavy leather suitcase toward a waiting black sedan. "Going somewhere?" I called, stepping onto the sidewalk. She froze. She turned slowly, and in the harsh glare of the street lamp, I finally got a good look at her. She wasn't a secretary. She was the woman ID seen in the Sterling Vaughan lobby. Months ago, Thorne's personal assistant, Miss Llewellyn. She held a small, silver-plated revolver in her hand, but it wasn't pointed at me. It was shaking. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said, her voice cracking. "Julian promised that if we put the records in the Brownstone, Wolfe would never look. He said Wolfe was too arrogant to check his cellar. But Julian got greedy. He wanted to keep the blue ledger for himself. He tried to lock me out of the tunnel. "So you gave him a permanent lock," I said, taking a cautious step forward. "Where's the rest of it, Miss Llewellyn?" The velvet box Vance threw out the window. "It's empty," she cried. "The real assets are in the epoxy. The micro dots are sealed inside the mustard pot. That's why we had to return. We had to retrieve the seal." Before I could move, the black sedan's door flew open. The driver's granite-jawed man from the Buick didn't reach for a gun. He reached for Miss Llewellyn, hauling her into the car with a brutal efficiency that told me she was no longer a partner, but a liability. The car roared to life, tires screaming on the wet asphalt. I didn't fire, there were too many civilians on the corner. I watched the red taillights vanish into the fog. I had the folders, I had the tunnel location, and I had the confession. But the pressure was still building. I headed back through the judge's house and into the tunnel, crawling through the damp earth until I emerged into our own furnace room. Wolfe was waiting there, standing by the coal chute with his hands behind his back. He didn't look surprised to see me emerge from a hole in the wall. "The vacuum is created," Archie, Wolfe said, his eyes reflecting the glow of my flashlight. "The suspects are scattered, the evidence is in our hands, and the mustard pot is currently being analyzed by Fritz. It is time to summon the survivors. Tell Saul to bring the blue folders. We are going to have a conversation in the office that Marcus Thorne will remember for the rest of his very short professional life." The Brownstone was no longer a home, it had become a vacuum, and Nero Wolfe was the one controlling the pressure. I emerged from the coal tunnel, dusting the grime of the judge's cellar from my sleeves, to find Wolfe already seated behind his desk. He hadn't changed his clothes, but he looked as though he had spent the last hour mentally scrubbing every inch of the office. On the blotter, next to the hollowed-out Blackstone, sat the silver mustard pot. Fritz had truly cleaned it this time, and the translucent epoxy had been scooped out into a glass laboratory dish, where it sat like a clump of hardened amber. "The microdots, Archie," Wolfe said, gesturing with a tip of his fountain pen toward the amber mass. Fritz discovered them suspended within the adhesive, a masterstroke of concealment. While we were searching for ledgers and boxes, the literal proof of the Sterling Vaughan embezzlement was sitting in a condiment jar, waiting to be smeared onto a permanent structural seal within that tunnel. "Llewellyn is in the wind," I reported, taking my chair and reaching for the telephone. She hopped into the Buick with the man from the hydrant. "She thinks she's escaping, but she left the folders in the judge's basement. Saul is bringing them through the tunnel now. What about our guests upstairs?" "Leave them to their anxiety," Wolfe murmured. "Anxiety is a far more effective interrogator than a rubber hose. Mr. Vance believes he has successfully disposed of the velvet box, and Miss Vane believes her brother's death was a tragic necessity of his own greed. We shall allow those delusions to ripen until they are ready to fall." For the next 40 minutes, Wolfe practiced the art of tactical silence. He didn't speak to me, he didn't ring for beer, and he didn't even pick up a book. He sat with his eyes closed, his rhythmic breathing the only sound in the room, while I watched the clock and waited for Saul. This is the part of the job that doesn't make it into the Sunday supplements, the long, agonizing stretch where you know the trap is set, but you don't know if the tiger is going to walk into it or decide to go for a walk in the park instead. Saul Panzer appeared through the hallway door at 5:30, carrying the blue-bound folders as if they were the crown jewels. He looked a bit more bedraggled than usual, with a smear of soot across his cheek, but his eyes were bright. "The Buick is parked 3 blocks east, Archie," Saul said, dropping the folders onto the desk. "They aren't running. They're waiting. They think they can still get back into the tunnel to retrieve the epoxy. They don't know we've already harvested the crop. Then we shall give them the opportunity," Wolfe said, his eyes snapping open. "Archie, call Inspector Cramer. Tell him I have a corpse in my basement, a multi-million-dollar fraud in my office, and a pair of fugitives sitting in a grey sedan on 38th Street. But tell him he is not to move until I give the signal. If he descends prematurely, the secondary vault will remain a legal ambiguity. I want them inside this house under my lights before the handcuffs are produced." I made the call. Cramer didn't like never does, but the mention of a dead auditor and the Sterling Vaughan Trust was enough to make him swallow his pride. He promised a squad car on every corner, out of sight, and a direct line to the office. Now, Wolfe said, standing up with a monumental effort that seemed to displace the very air in the room. The positioning is complete. We have the physical evidence, the architectural breach, and the psychological desperation of our subjects. Archie, bring Mr. Vance and Miss Vane, and tell Fritz to prepare the beer. I find that a cold glass of Remit is the only suitable accompaniment for the exposure of a murderer. I went to the stairs, feeling the familiar hum of the Brownstone's machinery clicking into gear. The violation of the house was about to be answered with a precision that was purely Wolfian. As I reached the landing of the south room, I heard Arthur Vance's Persinger, frantic, uneven stride that told me his polished silver exterior was finally starting to tarnish. "Mr. Wolfe is ready for you," I said, opening the door, "and bring your best excuses. You're going to need them." Vance looked at me, his eyes darting toward the window, then at the door. He knew the vacuum was pulling him. He straightened his tie one last time, a reflex of a man who spent his life hiding behind appearances, and followed me down to the office. The gathering was about to begin, and for the first time since the doorbell rang at 9:30, the mountain was looking hungry. The office was as quiet as a cathedral just before the organist hits the first chord. Nero Wolfe sat behind his desk, his bulk filling the custom-built chair with an air of judicial finality. Saul Panzer was leaning against the bookshelf near the door, looking like a man who had seen everything and was unimpressed by most of it. I stood by the window watching the street. The rain had slowed to a greasy mist, and the grey sedan had moved. It was now idling just 2 doors down near the judge's service entrance. They were coming for their epoxy, and they were coming now. "Sit," Wolfe commanded, as I led Arthur Vance and Genevieve Vane into the room. Vance took the red leather chair, his silver hair catching the light from the desk lamp. He looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from carrying a secret that's too heavy for a man of his build. Genevieve took the smaller yellow chair, her back as straight as a ruler. She still had that frozen look on her face, but her eyes were darting toward the basement door. "We are assembled," Wolfe said, his voice a low, resonant hum, "not to discuss a merger or a family estate, but to discuss a trespass. A man was killed in my furnace room. A book was mutilated in my library. A silver mustard pot was misappropriated in my kitchen. These are not merely crimes of violence or theft. They are crimes of impertinence." "My brother is dead, Mr. Wolfe," Genevieve said, her voice trembling. "Is that an impertinence to you?" "Death is a biological inevitability," Miss Vane, Wolfe snapped, "but choosing my basement as a tomb is a calculated insult. You and your brother Julian conspired to use this house as a safe zone for the Sterling Vaughan audits. You believe that because I value my privacy, I would inadvertently protect your stolen data from Marcus Thorne. You were wrong. You didn't just bring the records, you brought the killers." Vance leaned forward, his hands gripping the chair's arms. "I told you, I was only here to retrieve the box. I didn't know Julian was in the basement. I thought he had already fled to Europe." "You are a liar, Mr. Vance," Wolfe said, not with heat, but with a cold, clinical certainty. "You knew Julian was dead because you were the one who hired the security to ensure he didn't change his mind about the distribution of the funds. You threw that velvet box into the alley not to hide evidence, but to signal the driver of that sedan that the office was clear. But the very person you trusted to handle the details betrayed you. At that moment, the buzzer in the kitchen sounded 3 short bursts. It was Fritz's signal from the basement. Someone had entered the coal tunnel from the judge's side. "Archie," Wolfe said, his eyes narrowing, "our guests have arrived. Open the door." I moved to the basement door and pulled it wide. The sound of heavy footsteps on the wooden stairs echoed into the hallway. A moment later, Miss Llewellyn entered the office, her beige coat stained with soot and her face pale with desperation. Behind her was the man with the granite jaw, his hand resting inside his jacket pocket in a way that didn't suggest he was looking for a handkerchief. "The epoxy is gone," Llewellyn hissed, ignoring the rest of us and looking straight at Vance. "The jar is empty. You told me the seal was still in the pot." "It is," Wolfe said, tapping the glass dish on his desk. "But it is no longer your seal. It is my evidence. Miss Llewellyn, I assume you are the one who knows the way to my herb garden." The one who used the kitchen shears to mark the black stone? She turned to Wolfe, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and realization. Julian was going to cut me out. He was going to take the microdots and leave me to face Thorn alone. I had to stop him. And so you used the tunnel, Wolfe said. You killed him in the dark, tucked him behind the bricks, and then spent the next 12 hours trying to retrieve the very proof you had hidden. It was a comedy of errors performed in a morgue. Mr. Vance provided the blueprints, you provided the knife, and the gentleman behind you provided the muscle, a trifecta of incompetence. The man in the doorway moved his hand, but before he could clear his pocket, Saul Panzer had a .38 leveled at his chest. Saul doesn't miss, and the man knew it. He froze, his jaw tightening until the muscles stood out like cords. The vacuum is full, Wolfe remarked, leaning back and closing his eyes. Archie, the signal. I believe Inspector Cramer has waited long enough. Tell him the secondary vault is open, and the contents are ready for collection. I picked up the phone and gave the word. Outside, the sirens began their lonely rising wail. The faithless had been summoned, and in the quiet of the office, the only thing left was the sound of Genevieve Vane finally beginning to weep. The sirens didn't just wail, they converged, a mechanical chorus of justice that usually signals the end of a very long day for me and a very long decade for the people in the yellow chairs. Inspector Cramer didn't wait for the doorbell this time. He and a trio of plainclothesmen burst into the hallway with the kind of heavy-footed enthusiasm that Fritz generally finds offensive to his rugs. Cramer stomped into the office, his iron-grey hair damp from the drizzle and his cigar clamped between his teeth like a bit. "All right, Wolfe," Cramer barked, his eyes sweeping the room from the soot-stained Miss Llewellyn to the pale, trembling Arthur Vance. "The boys have the sedan boxed in, and I've got a team in the judge's basement. Now, what's this about a body in the coal chute? If you've been sitting on a corpse since breakfast, you'll have your license for a dartboard." Wolfe didn't even open his eyes. "The corpse is in the furnace room, Inspector. It has been since last night. If you had arrived any earlier, you would have merely interrupted the choreography. As it stands, you are just in time for the denouement." "Denouement, my foot," Cramer growled, but he signaled his men to secure the suspects. "Who's the stiff?" "Julian Vane," Wolfe said, his voice flat and clinical. "An auditor for the Sterling Vaughan Trust. He was murdered by Miss Llewellyn with the tactical assistance of Mr. Vance. The motive was not merely the theft of the Trust's assets, but the preservation of a much larger fraud involving the Holloway Group merger. The proofy, actual, immutable proofies currently suspended in that glass dish." I watched Miss Llewellyn. She wasn't the shadow anymore, she was just a tired woman in a ruined coat who had realized that a coal tunnel is a very narrow place to build a future. She looked at Vance, her eyes burning with a sudden, sharp clarity. "He told me Julian had the ledger," she whispered, pointing a shaking finger at the silver-haired trustee. "He told me if Julian got to Wolfe first, we'd all be in Sing Sing by Tuesday. He gave me the knife, Inspector. He gave me the blueprints. He even told me where the kitchen shears were kept so I could mark the drop spot." Vance didn't move. He didn't shout. He just sat there, looking like a man who had spent his life calculating risks and had finally encountered a variable he couldn't bribe. "She's hysterical," he said softly. "I was an observer. I came here to protect the trust. You came here to protect your percentage," Wolfe snapped, his eyes blinking. "You used your own brother as a pawn, Mr. Vance. You knew Julian was sentimental about this. House had consulted me years ago on a minor matter regarding his father's estate. You suggested the sanctity of the Brownstone as a hiding place, knowing that once Julian was inside, he would be trapped. You didn't want the ledger protected, you wanted it buried with the man who held it." Wolfe leaned forward, his bulk casting a massive shadow over the desk. "The genius of the plan was its reliance on my own habits. You assumed I would see the body, call the police, and that in the ensuing chaos, the secondary vault next door would remain invisible. You used the judge's house as a staging ground, moving back and forth through the tunnel to monitor my progress. But you forgot one thing, Mr. Vance. You forgot I am a creature of order. When you moved the third volume of Blackstone, you didn't just hide a secret, you created a vacuum in my environment. And I loathe a vacuum. Cramer took the glass dish with the epoxy-embedded microdots, handling it as if it were a live grenade. The lab will have these under a microscope in an hour. If these are the Trust's transfer records, Wolfe, I'll give you your denouement. But what about the granite jaw in the car? Mr. Vale, I supplied, nodding toward the man Saul was still holding at bay. He's the Holloway Group muscle. He was the one who was supposed to retrieve the microdots once the seal had dried. He's been sitting on our hydrant for 2 days, acting as a lookout. He's the one who picked up Miss Llewellyn after she tossed the south room looking for the velvet box which, as it turns out, was just another of Mr. Vance's distractions. The office was suddenly very loud as the officers began the business of leading the suspects away. Genevieve Vane walked out without looking back, her grief finally replaced by a cold, hard dignity. Miss Llewellyn was weeping now, a low, broken sound that echoed in the hallway. Arthur Vance went out last, his head held high, still pretending that he was just a victim of a very complicated misunderstanding. Wolfe waited until the front door slammed shut for the last time. He stayed in his chair, his hands resting on his lap, staring at the empty spot on the bookshelf where the 3rd volume of Blackstone should have been. The silence of the Brownstone began to return, but it was a heavy, bruised silence. "Archie," Wolfe said after a long moment. "The mustard pot. Is it truly clean?" "Fritz spent 20 minutes on it," I said. "It's ready for the English mustard. No epoxy, no microdots, no conspiracies." "Good," Wolfe grunted. "Then tell Fritz we are ready. The disruption is over. The mountain is no longer awake, it is hungry." The front door had finally clicked shut with a definitive, heavy thud that signaled the end of the municipal invasion. The flashing red and blue lights that had been dancing against the office wallpaper for the last hour had moved on, taking the sirens and the shouting with them toward the precinct. The Brownstone was ours again, though it felt as if the very air had been bruised by the presence of so many people who didn't know the difference between a rare orchid and a dandelion. I stood by the window, watching the last tail lights of the crime scene van disappear into the Manhattan fog, and I felt a sudden, sharp craving for a sandwich that didn't involve a cross-examination. I turned back to the room. Nero Wolfe was still in his chair, but the judicial tension had left his face, replaced by a brooding, colossal weariness. He was staring at the gap in his bookshelves where the 3rd volume of Blackstone's commentaries had been mutilated. To others, it was just a book. To Wolfe, it was a member of the household that had been assaulted in the line of duty. "I've called the binder on 58th Street, I said, breaking the silence. "He says if the spine isn't cracked, he can tip in new pages and match the calfskin by Thursday. It won't be original, but it'll look a lot better than a hollowed-out corpse for a ledger." Wolfe didn't look up. "It is a patch, Archie. Surgical scar on the face of reason. To use the law as a physical shield for violating the law is a paradox that even a master binder cannot reconcile. Mr. Vance and his cohorts did not merely seek to steal money, they sought to steal the very geography of my life. They turned my basement into a tomb and my library into a dead drop." "Thayer in the hands of the district attorney now," I reminded him, sitting at my desk and beginning the tedious process of straightening the items Miss Llewellyn had disturbed. "Vance is already trying to blame the whole thing on Julian's ghost, but Cramer has the microdots and the confession. They won't be bothering our furniture again for a very long time." Fritz appeared in the doorway, his face restored to its natural state of culinary poise. The aroma following him was enough to make a man forget he'd spent the morning looking at a body in a coal chute. It was the lamb roasting with rosemary, garlic, and a hint of something that smelled like heaven in a roasting pan. "The table is set, sir," Fritz announced, "and the endives have been braised with the new butter. I have also prepared the English mustard, real mustard in the silver pot." Wolfe stood up, a slow and majestic process that seemed to require the cooperation of the entire room. He adjusted his waistcoat, his yellow-gold eyes flickering toward the kitchen. "Thank you, Fritz. We shall require a bottle of the Montrachet. The palate must be cleansed of the taste of corporate mendacity." As we moved toward the dining room, the house seemed to settle back onto its foundations. The secret tunnel next door had been sealed with a temporary police barricade, and the secondary vault was now just an empty basement belonging to a Florida-bound judge. The disruption was over, but as I pulled out Wolfe's chair, I couldn't help but think about the way a few bricks and a silver pot had nearly brought the mountain down. "You know," I said, taking my own seat as Fritz began to carve, "it's a good thing you're a creature of habit. If you didn't notice a misplaced book or a dirty mustard pot, Vance might have actually pulled it off. He banked on you being too big to notice the small things." Wolfe paused, the carving knife glinting in the candlelight. He looked at me with a steady, unblinking gaze. "Habit, Archie, is the only defense we have against the chaos of the world. A man who does not notice the displacement of a volume of Blackstone is a man who has already surrendered his intellect to the mob. They believe that because they are loud and numerous, they can overwrite the quiet order of a single room. They are mistaken." He served a slice of lamb, steam rising in a fragrant cloud. The Sterling Vaughan Trust was built on the assumption that numbers can be manipulated indefinitely. They forgot that eventually those numbers must reside in a physical reality, a ledger, a microdot, or a grave. I merely provided the reality. "And the rosemary?" I asked, reaching for the silver mustard pot. "What about the spring they left in the book?" Wolfe allowed himself the smallest of smiles, sir, mere twitch of the lips that indicated he was, for the moment, satisfied with the universe. "Rosemary is for remembrance, Archie. I suspect Mr. Vance will have plenty of time for that in the years to come. For us, however, it is merely a seasoning. Pass the salt, if you please. I find the evening has developed a certain chill that only a well-marbled roast can truly address." I passed the salt, took a bite of the best lamb in the Western Hemisphere, and realized that for all the bodies and the break-ins, the Brownstone was still the safest place in the city. As long as the beer was cold and the books were where they belonged, Nero Wolfe was in his heaven, and the rest of us just had to keep the front door bolted. "Just don't expect me to start checking the mustard every morning," I quipped. Wolfe didn't answer. He was already busy with the endives. The quiet hours had returned, and in this house, that was the only victory that really counted.